Please, at this time. Next Tuesday on the 24th, both in person. We're going to push that as long as we can, and online. So we're giving people an option. Longtime Hinton, West Virginia journalist and professor Tony Hilton has written a novel called Enough, about corruption in a small town and abuse of power. Somebody has given me feedback. Okay, thank you. Next Tuesday in 2 weeks, here on this podium, actually on the stage, for the Ruther Pollock Labor Heritage Week, we will discuss Storming Heaven, a novel of Blair Mountain and other works with the legendary West Virginia writer Denise Giardina. Very happy to have her here. And she will discuss the artistic side of writing with West Virginia Poet Laureate Mark Harshman, and the labor issues in her novels with Patrick Cassidy, a labor attorney of 40-some years. Our guest today is Damian Dressick. He is the author of the novel 40 Patchtown, published by Bottom Dog Press in their Appalachian writing series, and the story collection Fables of the Deconstruction, from Clash Books. His creative work has appeared in more than 50 literary journals and anthologies, including W.W. Norton's New Micro, Still the Journal, and several others. Dressick, a Blue Mountain Residency Fellow, Dressick is the winner of the Harriet Arno Award and the Jesse Stewart Prize. He co-hosts Wanna Live, a virtual reading series that brings some of the best Appalachian writers to the world, and he edits the journal Appalachian Lit. His website is DamianDressick.com. Here he is, Damian Dressick.
Well, thank you, Sean. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and thanks to you all for coming out. It's nice to see so many people. I think this is the first reading, even though this book came out last year, this is the first live, actual, in the flesh reading I've given. So it's amazing to see such a turnout. So thank you, everyone. I'd also like to thank the Ohio County Public Library for its generous support and the wonderful series that it's been doing. Sean just told me it's been going on for 15 years, and it's so wonderful to have that opportunity as a writer to come out and talk to folks about what you're doing and share your work with them. It's lovely to see everybody here. So today I'm going to read from this novel 40 Patchtown, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the research process and when it comes to writing a historical novel, and what it means to kind of put together and play with history in a fictional way. And maybe if we have a little extra time, I have sort of one of the stories in Fables takes place in the same town, but sort of a more mythical version of the town, about 80 years later. So I'm going to start with the opening chapter of 40 Patchtown. The only thing I suppose you might need to know is that it is set during the 1922 coal strike, which was one of the most, especially in Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, one of the most brutal labor struggles in American history. The only other thing I'd like to say is there's a lot of ethnic slurs in particularly the opening of the book, and it was something that I felt was important to see the characters progressing from one way of thinking to another, and also just to simply render the speech as they might have spoken at the time, or they did speak at the time. So. One. I can smell the bony fires blowing up the ridge from Eureka 40. The sulfur smoke drifts over the powerhouse, the drift mouth, and across the rail yard, tops the frame houses, wafts through the bare trees in McCluskey's stubble pasture, and slides up where it mixes with the cigarette smoke and corn whiskey stink coming off of my brother Buzzy's pea coat, which is 2 sizes too big for me. Little Mikey and me, we're keeping a watch. We're laying stock still, our legs wrapped tight and our shoulders held low, our fingers fixed fast to the fat, high limb of the big silver maple jutting out of the woods off to the side of McCluskey's barn. Behind us, on the ground, in a tight cluster of oaks, my brother Buzzy and Stosh and Baldy, friends of his from down Eureka 37, stand waiting. It's been near 20 minutes since the mine whistle let loose the shift. Looking through the woods, across the far pasture, I can already see a thin sliver of moon hanging low above McCluskey's barn. My elbows ache fierce and I'm getting distracted, watching the breeze catch hold of my breath and push it up through the smooth, bare branches when Mikey digs his fingers into my arm. Look, Chet, Mikey cups a whisper into my ear. Them damn scabs is coming up the hill. At first, I don't see them, but when the scabs get over the next rise and start through the pasture, I can make out the light from their carbide lamps. I count 2 and then 3. And I'm glad Buzzy brought his baseball bat. Mikey drops a rock to signal the fellows below us, and I watch their shadows move forward in the darkness. I tighten my grip across the sharp edge rock I snatched up down in the Paint Creek shallows, but I ain't gonna hit nothing from here. So I slip the rock back into my pocket, and branch by branch, Mike and me, we climb down out of the maple. At the last limb, we let go and drop down into a thick pile of soggy leaves. Buzzy pulls me up by the hand and wraps his arm around my shoulder. He nods to Mikey and me, and Stosh and Baldy hold up their sticks and slap them into their hands. We get tight up against the trees and wait. I share a tree trunk with Buzzy. That dark brown bark is rough, right flush up against my cheek, but I ain't gonna kick none about that. Buzzy sticks his head out every couple seconds, keeping his eyes peeled for them scabs. But in the end, it don't matter, because the scabs coming up the rise is singing. A little quiet, maybe, but singing for sure. Some damn Italian song I can't quite make out. I poke my head for a peek. When the Mai Tais draw even with the stand of oaks, I can see clear there's really 4 of them. The one out front looks to be my age, 14, and the fat one in the middle with the cigarette is maybe 17, like Buzzy. The other 2 look grown. The one in the front is thick-chested and limping a little. The scab trailing up the rear is tall, real thin, like he ain't ate good for a while. Buzzy takes a deep breath and steps out from behind the oak tree. I pop out from the other side. Buzzy pulls back his arm and heaves his rock. That piece of fieldstone whizzes right toward the chest of the scab with the limp. Even through his heavy leather pit vest, Buzzy's rock must thud good and hard, because the scab doubles over and the rock plops to the ground. The scabs start yelling some kind of shit in the Italian, and one of the other scabs grabs the one that got hit by the crook of his arm and pulls him back up to standing. Then the Mai Tais start running like all hell. Watching them scabs, Buzzy starts to yell, and his voice is loud and deep. He's cursing them scabs out fierce. He calls them stinking digos and sons of bitches as they dash by. You try and take my job, you scabs better run, Buzzy shouts. The Mai Tais are going full tilt when I let my rock fly. I take aim at the scab closest to the trees, but I don't hit nothing. Buzzy looks over at me sharp and quick. I want to tell him I've done my best, but I can see it ain't going to make no difference to him. Either I hit the scab or I didn't. End of goddamn story. Scrambling into the woods, the Mai Tai scabs is dropping lunch pails, headlamps, blasting caps, the whole shooting match, making back for the shower house where they come from. Waving hickory switches, we're after them like dogs on a rabbit. They're cursing, and we're heaving chunks of rock and yelling for them not to be scabbing on us. Halfway down the ridge, the scabs divide up. And Mikey and Stosh and me follow the kid, the limper, and the old man through the woods along the edge of the pasture. Out of the corner of my eye, I see Buzzy waving his bat while him and Baldy chase deeper into the woods after the tall scab. Let my switch drop to my side as I run in the twilight. I use my hand to keep those fast-coming branches from smacking me across my gob. I catch up to Mikey and Stosh real fast because I'm the quickest runner in all of 40 Patchtown. When I get even with them, Mikey and Stosh are whooping and hollering for them scabs to keep running. Back to Italy, you digos. After we've been running a time, I can see Mikey and Stosh are getting tired, maybe losing their wind a bit. But I catch a flash of one of them scabs headed over the hill back toward McCluskey's farmhouse, and I give a whoop and take off full of vinegar for the top of the rise, leaving Mikey and Stosh to catch up with me best they can. And when I get to the top of the hill, I rake my eyes across the fields from the farmhouse down toward the tipple. I don't see nothing. I turn back to look for Mikey and Stosh, but the big-chested scab must have been hiding himself behind one of them oaks or locust trees, because when I turn around for a second gander at them fields, he's standing there staring at me. I raise my switch up, and he eyes me curious. He says some shit in Dago and starts walking toward me like he's just waiting to ask where they keep the lamp oil stocked in the pick-me store. I start whipping my switch around a little bit just to show him I mean business. But he keeps closing on me anyhow, and I'm getting spooked, and I start shouting for Stosh and Mikey. The scab don't pay no mind till he hears Dash yelling back to me through the trees. Then he's in front of me quick, and I realize for the first time just how much bigger the scab is than me. I know I'm small for 14, but you'd think I could do more than just looking right in the middle of his scab chest. Worrying I won't get no shot to get in a lick, I tighten up my grip on the switch and wind up to take a poke. But the scabby catches me by the wrist. I am hollering blue murdering thanks to Christ. Stosh and Mikey come hollering back. The scab looks over my shoulder, and before I can say so much as boo, lets me have one across the kisser. That punch puts me on the ground, and when I look up, the scab's off through the woods back in the direction of the 40 drift mouth. Breathing hard, I rub my cheek, and I can feel a smear of blood on my hand before I even look. Mostly, I'm in shock, like I've been in all my share of scraps like every Patchtown boy, but I never knew anything could happen so fast as that scab's punch landed on me. Stosh and Mikey come crashing through the bushes at the top of the hill. Mikey's saying, "Christ almighty, Chester, you all right?" And I'm nodding, and then Stosh is picking me up off the ground and putting my switch back in my hand. I tell him them scabs split up, and I come face to face with the toughest one. Stosh is laughing, and he says, "We should find Buzzy and Baldy and head back to 40 Patchtown." When we find Buzzy, him and Baldy got the long-legged scab cornered in McCluskey's drainage ditch. Baldy's on one side, and Buzzy's on the other. Every time the scab tries to climb out, they give him a whack on the hands. There's one scab getting more than he bargained for, Stosh says. We're watching Baldy wrap the eye tie a good one on his wrist when he tries to grip the scraggly clusters of roots hanging down into the ditch. Mikey and me, we nod, and the three of us push forward for a closer look. The scab's splashing around in a foot or two of water, and his hands are getting to look pretty well whacked apart, all scraped and bleeding. We're all yelling at that scab, telling him he is in deep. Stosh and me start picking up little rocks and whipping him at the scab, catching him in his chest and his legs. He's putting his hands up and cursing us in Dago. Buzzy's not one to take no cursing from a scab. He jumps right down into the ditch. He's swinging the bat around, and the scab is ducking and bobbing and looking to bolt. But the scab can't get away because the ditch is high on the sides, and where the water comes down, it's slick and steep. Scab ought to know. We catch him. He's due for a beatdown. It's only fair. Ain't none of us been on strike 6 months starving so sons of bitches can come into Windber, Pennsylvania and earn $4 a day. Scab in Eureka 40, Patchtown mine. Stand still and take your medicine, or you'll catch it worse, Buzzy tells him. But the scab don't listen no-how and charges on Buzzy. Splashing through the water, he's reaching out like to grab Buzzy by his throat. I ain't scared for Buzzy because he's plenty tough. He's got muscles like an ox from shoveling coal and them 2-tonners. The beast seems since he was younger than me. Besides, he's taller than our pa was before he got killed down in them West Virginia mines. See how much you can load with a broken arm, you scabbing bastard. Buzzy swings on the scab like he's going hard for a fastball down Delaney Field. The bat's a blur, and I can hear it cut the air with a whiff. And then there's a sound like a brick hitting a watermelon. The scab's standing there all still, and Buzzy pulls the bat away from his ear. And none of us are saying nothing. Buzzy lets the bat drop to his leg. The scab stands there for a second like he's froze. And we look to each other face to face, round in a circle. And there's a stillness, calm-like. Like time can't go forward, not at all. And then the scab crashes down into the dark water, and it's like everyone can move again. Baldy says, Jesus Christ. And Stosh is squinting and looking at the body floating in the drainage. He says, Jesus Christ is right. Is he dead, Mikey asks. Buzzy, I says, we better get out of here. Buzzy shakes his head and shoves the bat in the water a couple times, trying to wash off the blood. He says, my brother's right. Let's go. We get clear of that drainage ditch right away and head back through the woods toward 40. We don't need telling, but Buzzy says we got to keep our trap shut about this scab. It's a bad business, Stosh says. Buzzy nods and pulls a plug of tobacco from his britches. He bites off a corner and passes it around. When it comes to me, I gnaw off a piece and work the bitter plug back into my cheek. When everybody has some, Buzzy puts it back in his pocket, and we start hoofing the Red Dog toward the lights of the 40 Hotel. Chapter 2. Well, thank you. Thanks. I'm going to read one more chapter so you get a sense of how the novel progresses, and how the sort of the strike progresses as well. Our house is on 2nd Street, a 40 Patchtown. We're to the front door before Buzzy notices my face is all swollen and cut. I don't feel like talking none, but he gets it out of me what happened. Then he whacks me on the side of my head, says I shouldn't worry about it now. Can't you see you gotta be tough to survive in this damn Patchtown? I tell him, okay. I spit the tobacco out of my mouth into the yard before I go in the house. Cabbage is cooking on the coal stove. My ma is at the zinc table, wrapping pieces of ground meat into cabbage leaves, which is what us Polacks call pigs in a blanket. I'm hungry as hell, but my guts feel twisted up since we walked away from that drainage, and I don't feel much like eating. My ma's bitching that the twins ain't back from the 40 rock dump with the coal for tonight. She says it's getting damn late. It'll be all right, Lottie. My sister Lottie says. Them kids has been going down there since the damn strike started 6 months ago. Lottie's next oldest to Buzzy. She's almost 17. She don't take no shit. She got long hair, dark as percolator coffee, and bright green eyes. She's so pretty, most everybody takes her shit, except for me and Buzzy. We laugh and tell her she must think she's the Queen of England, always running around, pulling her hair back, pushing her tits together in the kitchen mirror. My ma is stirring cabbage leaves into tomorrow's soup and yelling for me and Buzzy to get out to the rock dump. Stop fooling with your tresses, she tells Lottie. Get the potatoes ready. We're going to sit down and eat as soon as the twins get back. Buzzy's idling in the parlor. I go in and sit down next to him. He's already got dry pants on, and his feet are propped up on the sofa. The baseball's on the radio, but you don't look to be listening none. I ain't going to no swag heap to get them twins, he yells to our ma. Send Johnny. Now, I know this is crazy, because Johnny's 8, but he's slow in the head. He probably couldn't find the rock dump, let alone the twins, and sure not his way home even if he did get there. I poke Buzzy in the ribs and ask him what he's thinking. Ask him if he's drunk. He shushes me with his finger. Pulls me closer to him on the sofa. Quiet, he says to me. I don't want us seen outside the house no more together. My mother yells again from the kitchen about fetching Esther and Frankie. Buzzy jabs his fingertip into my chest, keeping me on the couch. Send Johnny down there, he yells to our ma. He don't do shit all day. My ma drops the lid back on the soup pot. She comes stomping into the parlor. She's a big woman and heavy, so the floor squeaks when she walks. When she comes into the parlor, she's glaring, and the floor sounds like somebody's killing a rat. She's yelling at Buzzy for being so selfish and so lazy, and she sees my face is all swollen and cut. Chester Pistakowski, she says to me, what the hell happened to you? I looked at Buzzy, then at the radio, and finally, at the big crucifix up on the parlor wall. I start to say something about scrapping with some boys from 37, but my ma don't let me talk. She just starts in on Buzzy, telling him he's no good, telling him he'll get me in deep someday. It was a fair fight, is all Buzzy says to our ma. I can see him rubbing his fingers together like he's got nerves. He's looking out the window, watching the street. He ain't looking at our ma no matter what kind of shit she says to him. In the middle of getting yelled at, Buzzy just gets up and drifts into the kitchen. My ma follows him, but she should know not to keep on Buzzy like that when he's getting pissed, because he'll take a poke first and he ain't going to confession no time soon. Staring out of the kitchen window, Buzzy finally says something. He says, no, twins are back. I race over to the window and look out, and I see Esther and Frankie coming down through the yard, past the shithouse and the chicken coop. They're near 10, but stooped over, carrying flour sacks of coal from the rock dump. When they come in, my ma gives them hell for taking so long. How yin's going to stay in the 4th grade if you can't even fetch coal? Frankie shrugs and takes the coal down to the bin in the cellar. Esther stands in the middle of the kitchen, fisting up the linen of her dress. She's shouting about how they had to go behind 3rd Street because the Pinkertons is all up and down 2nd. What you mean the Pinkertons? Buzzy asks. He looks at Esther with his lips curled and his eyes pinned. I can see he's wound up good. Frankie comes running back up from the basement all excited. He says, they was on horses coming up 2nd Street. We watched them from behind Zacek's chicken coop. They was banging on doors, going into houses. They was getting men out in their yards. Get some beating, my sister Esther says, her eyes wide. How bad a beating, I ask. Buzzy grabs hold of my shirt. He says, don't worry about how bad a beating. He pulls me across the kitchen to the stairs and sets me on my ass on the bottom step. Yanking onto my ear, he pulls his face right in breathing distance so no one can hear what he's going to tell me. He pushes his finger hard into my cheek, right below the cut. You're going into the attic. You got to wait till I come for you, Chester. Buzzy scowls, pushes his mouth up to my ear and says real soft, this ain't no bullshit. You know these is hard men. You do what I tell you. Okay, I say. Buzzy steps back and he stands up, says to everyone, Chet's already been in one fight today. He don't mean to be in another one. My ma's blessing herself, and I can see she don't believe a word of this. but she ain't gonna ask me no questions neither. Don't be saying nothing about Chester, she points a finger at the twins. I don't like to be chickening out or nothing, but I ain't gonna argue with Buzzy neither. I scram up the steps and open the door to the attic. I'm trying to get the steamer trunk pushed over so I can reach the ladder to get in when Lottie comes trotting up the stairs. Turning to face her, I take a deep breath, thinking she's come to give me hell for causing trouble. But she puts a roll into each of my hands. She says, "Thought you might be hungry." I take a bite out of one of the rolls and tell her thanks. She flashes her green eyes down at the linoleum on the floor of the hall. Pushing her foot around, she says, "Chester, you got to be careful running with Buzzy. He ain't bad exactly, but he's so full of mad, he don't always think about what's going to happen." I think I understand what she means, but I can't say nothing against Buzzy. I just tell her thanks for the rolls again. She gives me a smile and helps me push the trunk over to the lap. When she goes back down the stairs to help my mom, I hear the dishes clatter as they get the supper on the table. I climb up the ladder and push the whitewashed board away from the opening and yank myself up into the attic. It's dark and cool enough. I want to go back down to the kitchen and ask Buzzy for his coat. Instead, I light up a candle and put the board back. There's a couple of boxes of shit my mom brought up from West Virginia lying around, and I drop my dupa onto one of them. I'm sitting there quiet, chewing up the rest of them rolls, which is hard because my jaw hurts like hell when I open my mouth. I'm hoping my jaw ain't broke. I wouldn't mind so much a scar from this cut because that would look pretty hard and all, but a broken jaw, no thanks. After the rolls is gone, I'm still hungry and I'm getting bored of sitting. I can smell the dinner cooking down there, the meat and the cabbage. I'm listening to real careful what's going on downstairs, but all I hear is the sounds of them eating supper. They don't talk much, but I'm right above the kitchen, so I can hear the banging around plates and bowls. I'm thinking about the first time I seen the Pinkertons. It was back April of this year, 1922, right after the coal strike started up, and me and Buzzy was walking home from the first big union meeting out on Garula's farm. The Pinkertons come into town on horses, and we watched them ride down Joe Smolko and Lefty Jankowski, who was both motormen out Eureka 37. They chased them right up 9th Street, past Eureka's store. When they caught him, the Pinkertons busted up Joe and Lefty with a blackjack good. Beat them till their faces was so swole they couldn't see nothing. Buzzy told me that was revenge for the two of them wrecking a motor on the way into number 37 mine the first day of the strike so nobody could go down there to work. "Open up, you damn Polacks!" I hear somebody saying this, and I crawl over to the other side of the attic where there's a little slatted window at the peak of the roof. Looking between the slats, I can see these two Pinkerton bastards on my neighbor's porch. There's two of them in their blue suits all dolled up to look like the police. They're beating the door with a blackjack and yelling for old man Kosturku to come out. I want to say, well, maybe they ain't opening the door because them's Hungarians that live there are not Polacks, but I can see two more of the sons of bitches ride up to our house on dark horses. These two climb down and make for our front door. The one is tall and heavy set with a mustache that comes down past his mouth. He's already got his blackjack out, and he's slapping it against his leg. The other son of a bitch is sawing off and none too steady on his feet. The big one starts cracking his blackjack into our door. "Come on out, you Polacks," he says. "Open up this damn door." I hear feet shuffling across the floor and the key turning in the lock. I shift myself forward so I get a better look at what's going on. I watch the door crack open and see a wedge of light shining onto the porch. Then the fat son of a bitch drops his shoulder into our door and it goes flying back, the doorknob smashing against the wall. My ma is shouting high-pitched and these bastards rampage into our house. I hear furniture getting splintered and dishes shattering. They're screaming, and these no good bastards is calling my ma a stupid Polak bitch. "Where's your husband?" one is asking her. I can hear everything pretty clear because the walls of these Patchtown houses are as thin as paper. My ma is acting like she don't understand no English. She just keeps saying, Jezus Ołek nam, which is Polish for Jesus, save us. Listening to them cursing my mom, my stomach tightens up, and my nostrils are pulling apart. I want to spring down there and give them what for, but I told Buzzy I'd stick up here. I hear a crash, like a big piece of furniture getting busted up. That's when I finally hear Buzzy. His voice is loud and clear and mean as hell. It's the one he uses when somebody just got whipped bad enough for it to last a while, but he ain't near done whipping. He says, anything else you bastards want? And there's more crashing and more yelling, and Buzzy's yelling, his sons of bitches is yelling, plates is shattered, and the parlor is shaking like the San Francisco earthquake is rattling our kitchen to pieces. Then there's a crack, and everything goes pretty quiet until one of the Pinkertons says take Buzzy out in the backyard. I crawl over the boxes, rush into the slat window on the other side of the attic to see them drag Buzzy right out the back door. Both them Cossacks is covered with food and their uniforms is tore. The short one's got his lips split and the blood's run down his neck and dripped onto the front of his white shirt. Buzzy's kicking and struggling, but the big bastard's got him in some kind of wrestling hold. Help this boy out, Jim, big one says. The short one pulls his blackjack out, gives Buzzy two real quick right across his belly. But I can see he's still ready to go. The big Pinkerton must see it too, because he jerks Buzzy's head back by the hair. Help him out some more, Jim. This time the little Pinkerton gives Buzzy the blackjack across his knee. Buzzy's got his face all screwed up, and he's hollering like it hurt pretty good. One more time. Another crack at Buzzy's knee. The big bastard Cossack lets him go and shoves him forward into the yard. He stomps on Buzzy's hand and asks him what he knows about miners chasing scabs home from Eureka 40. Buzzy just groans, tells him to go piss up a tree. The little one says he probably don't know nothing anyhow. He says Pollock's is just too stupid to cause this much trouble. Then each of them bastards gives Buzzy a kick in his belly before they go peacocking back through the yard to their horses. Buzzy's still laying there, his bare feet wriggling out of the dungarees when the bastards climb up into the saddle and clomp away down 2nd Street toward the pygmy store. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, my. So one of the things folks often ask is, what research did you do to write this novel? And it's strange. I initially, when people started talking to me about that, I was more thinking about the formal research process, which involved, and I'll talk a little bit about this, but involved work, reading various doctoral dissertations, looking at library archives, newspapers, microfilm from back in the day. But I don't think that's really the truest or most important answer to that question. When I was a boy, 5 through probably 10, my father worked for the Bethlehem Steel Company. He was a craneman, and he did shift work, so he wasn't around a lot. And we had a neighbor who lived right next door, who was a retired miner in his late 60s, and he had retired rather early due to a black lung. And this gentleman was kind enough and very generous with his time, and I would sit on the porch swing with him every day, probably for 4 or 5 hours a day. I guess neither of us had that much to do. And I was flattered by an adult, having so much time and conversation with, talk with me. And I was very interested in hearing about his time in the coal mines prior to unionization. What was your life like when you were a young man? And that was where, that was, I think, the impetus for writing about this originally. As it was my first memories are hearing this man talk about the struggles that the miners were engaged in pre-Roosevelt, pre-National Labor Relations Act. and was telling me about the idea of men being paid in scrip. The sense that you were not actually paid in money, which in the early 1970s was incomprehensible to me as a child. Wait, you went to work and they didn't pay you in money? No, you got paid in scrip, or you got assigned a number, and almost everything you earned ended up being deducted from your paycheck, whether it was your rent. Also, the town owned the electric, the coal mine owned the electric company, so your electric bill, your water bill, everything that you earned and needed to buy in terms of supplies, both for living and for actually doing your job as a miner, because you were considered an independent contractor. We see it's funny because you see that now. Companies don't want to take responsibility for having employees. They want independent contractors. So, you need a pick, well, you're an independent contractor. You need blasting powder, you're an independent contractor. You need carbide lamp, well, you're an independent contractor. So all these things had to be purchased at the company store. So he was very generous again with telling me about what this was like. And the thing that blew me away also was the idea of the blacklist, that you could be blackballed from working in various coal mines due to you bought your furniture not at the company-owned store, but you bought your furniture somewhere else. You tried to get a better deal on mining supplies. You didn't vote the way you were supposed to. You tried to stand up for yourself in terms of representation. And he talked about, men would go from, you were working in mine 42. Windbur's there's a central town with maybe 6 to 8 patch towns outside of it at any given time. And you're working in mine 40. You got blackballed in mine 40 as Frankie Jankowski, so you're going to go to another one of these mines just before social security cards or anything like that. Tell them your name was Richie Shemansky. Okay, you can go back to work here if nobody knows who you are, or specifically drift off to one of the other Berwyn mines. So that blew me like wow, this company had so much power over you. And then I went off and became a marketing executive and forgot all about this for a long period of time. And then I became more interested in it later. And I think the other thing that is like really important in terms of what influenced me about writing this novel, B, something I think it's imperative that we as citizens understand is, I'm sure everybody in the room has heard the expression, the roaring 20s, the roaring, and you read, if you take a college class in literature of the 20s, they're going to hand you Ernest Hemingway, they're going to hand you F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Fitzgerald talks about, it was a decade in which the top 10% of the country in terms of income lived like kings. And this is the dominant narrative that we're handed. Like, this is how things were. But you never ask them the question, wait a second, what was the other 90% doing that the top 10% got to live like kings? I mean, I was thinking about, the kind of fiction I was reading, and I'm like, well, this doesn't really comport with any of the stories I've ever heard from my relatives, from people in my town. I mean, the only roaring they ever heard was the coal tipple. So I think that's the other thing that I was really interested in doing is exploring what was actually happening for the majority of people during the 1920s. So those were some of the big impetuses for the book. The research process, I moved from New York City I rented a miner's duplex in Mine 37. I'm going to show you a picture of that's the town of Mine 37. It's funny because it's the cover of the book, but people have actually written. I can tell where things are in 40. It's actually not Mine 40. It's the town of 37. So I rented a miner's strand duplex. I spent about 4 months doing nothing but research. A woman had written her doctoral dissertation from Penn State on the unionization of the mines and the new immigrants coming into Windber, and how that worked. So I was doing a lot of library research. I tried to talk, with the exception of my parents and the woman I was dating, I tried to literally not speak with anybody under the age of 75 for 9 months straight. As I talked to my a lot of folks who were alive, my grandmother was actually really instrumental, and there's chapters later on the farm because she grew up on a farm outside of Wimber. So one set of grandparents were responsible for one half of the book, and she was responsible for the farm life chapters, which my grandfather on my dad's side, actually this is the original, excuse me, the opening incident. The opening incident in chapter 1, that's I was very close to my grandfather. He only told one story about unionizing the mines. He was the same age as Chet in the book, and that was the story. It is not the murder part, but the idea of him and other boys waiting in the woods for the scabs to come out of the mines. And as you do the research, you learn what was actually happening is the coal companies were fomenting a lot of ethnic division, really making certain to keep each ethnic group separate and at odds, so divide and conquer. The other thing is they were trying to make sure that the folks, the non-new immigrants, were at the throats of the recent immigrants. And also this is real, this blew me away. If you do research, you can find these advertisements in Italian or Hungarian or Polish language newspapers in the early 1920s. They would be handed out in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. As the men came through Ellis Island and got off, they would have advertisements that would say in their native language, new mines opening, no labor troubles, big wages that were very, very high, like $2 a day, $4 a day, which in the early 1920s is a ridiculous amount of money. So these men would say, oh, wow, I just came to America, and here the streets are paved with gold. I am going to get on board with this. And they would get on trains, and then these folks, what they would call scab herders, would get on the trains with guns, and nobody was allowed to get off the train. And then the train would pull up, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is not a new mine open. The men would realize, you just got me in the middle of a labor dispute. And again, they don't speak English. So trying to make head or tail of this was a bit of a process, but the unscrupulousness of the coal company. So those are some of the other things that I learned about during during my research process. Also, what was the men were striking for was pay for dead work. So the way that the mining at that time worked is you were only paid for the coal you loaded. So anytime you spent blasting the face of the seam or dealing with rock, you weren't paid for any of that. Or there was maybe there was a problem in the mine that day. Well, you went there for nothing. Also, the Berwind-White Coal Company had, this may shock some of you, not only did they lower the men's pay, they did it retroactively. But yeah, it's like all the coal you mined last month, we were saying we're going to give you this much per ton. Well, actually, we're going to cut that by 25%. And furthermore, in Wimber proper, the miners were also striking for the right to unionize, to join a union. In other parts of Pennsylvania, they were unionized and the union was on strike. They were asking for the Berwind-White folks for representation. So I think this might be a good time to ask if folks have any questions.
The significance of the title of the book.
So thanks for asking. So as I was saying, Wimber is a small town in Pennsylvania. It was much more thriving until the late 1950s, and it was the main town. The people who would be bosses of the mine lived there, and then the owner maintained a large house, but they would come in for a couple of weeks a year. They lived in Philadelphia. E.J. Berwin. But the town was surrounded by Patchtowns, where they were maybe 3 streets right next to the coal mine with their own company store. So there were, over the years, about 12 of these, ranging from mine 30 to mine 42, some of which were much more lucrative and mined coal for a much longer time. So the towns would be, or these little patch towns would be referred to as nothing but numbers by the residents. Where are you from? I'm from 37. How about you? I'm from 42. So this is 40 Patchtown is where the narrator and his family live. They live on 2nd Street in 40 Patchtown.
So it was a neighborhood surrounding the whole mine that they were.
Yeah, the mine was right. I mean, the only reason these existed, the company owned all the houses that slapped together 3 streets of frame houses, and everybody who worked in that mine would live generally in that little patch town. And then this is interesting, how much control the companies at that time had. The company owned all the houses. So if you did anything to displease the company, not only were you out of a job, you had no place to live. They could evict you, and this is something else that happens. That's a company store, which is also in 37. So anything that you would need, not only could you buy there, you had to buy there at inflated prices. Yes?
Yeah, did the local police come to the aid of the scabs at all?
That's a great question.
Pinkertons, was that the only security there? Did the local town police help those people to go in when the strikes came?
Thank you for asking that. One of the things that truly shocked me, and maybe some of you all know this, the reason the Pennsylvania State Police exist, they were directly evolved out of what was called the coal and iron police. The mine owners required a police force that was not tied to a specific town or a borough or municipality. Imagine you have a town of 1,000 people and you need 200 policemen. Well, that's not reasonable. So they created a police force that could go anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania. Did they help the scabs? I think more they were interested. The coal and iron police were very much in the pocket of, paid directly by the operators. They were very much interested in making certain, not that people's rights weren't trod on, but they were very much certain that the coal mine was open, coal was getting mined and sent to New York City to run the subway lines, and sent to Philadelphia to fuel transatlantic steamships. So they were really, there was a huge police presence, but it was all in the service of keeping the miners at work and making sure the mines ran.
Supported the company.
Oh, very much so.
Scabs.
I think absolutely the raison d'etre for the police for organizing these large forces was they were in the pay of the operators. I know some of y'all are probably familiar with the Homestead strike. These folks, some of the same folks who were involved in that came to Windber later and were all instrumental in making sure that the strikers were not only beaten down, but creating situations that the sort of media construct would be like, oh, they're foreigners, they're invaders, you should not be on this. The strikers are not good folks. You should, these are these new immigrants, they're no good. So they were creating violence to make sure that it would reflect poorly on the men who are fighting for their rights.
By the way, this library only exists because of the Homestead strike. That's another story for another day. But Carnegie Library was rejected by the league. But anyway, we had a question online from Dr. Pistakowski, a mutual friend.
Okay.
Who made a point to say that she's watching from Ocean City, Maryland. I wrote that in, but the question why did you choose a 14-year-old protagonist?
That's a great question. That one I think is again, I go back to this idea of my grandfather telling me this story. And this was this guy who lived through all this stuff. He was a very taciturn man, not given to being a storyteller, not a raconteur of any stripe. And one day, he just delivered it kind of flat, very matter of factly, like you or I would say, "Oh, yeah, I had to go to Sheetz, bought some milk." It's like, yeah, back when I was 14 and 22, when they were trying to get the Union into the mines, we would wait in the woods. All the boys would wait for the scabs to come out of the mine, and we would chase them with sticks home, letting them know that they were scabbing on us, and this was no good. And then this does not make its way into the book till much later. The other thing he said was that the older men, the adults, this is very contentious about, would then dynamite the houses of the scabs when they were at work to show that this is a life or death. That's one of the things that I really truly admire about the miners, is they were very incredibly brave. Really, I feel like today, willing to stand up for their rights, to risk everything to get their family a fair shake. So that's why the 14-year-old protagonist is that's where I started with this. What would happen if? Let's think about, what kind of what ifs could happen if you've got boys chasing somebody home, and it starts out with this idea of Chet, getting punched in the face by this large scab. It's kind of, I don't say it's funny, but it's one kind of book. Now, that's not exactly the kind of book I'm interested in writing. And then it takes the much more serious turn of the murder, and then there's a huge crackdown on the miners due to the scab's murder. Yes, Undine, that's my daughter who's telling me.
So were the coal mines kind of like the hierarchy?
Was there a hierarchy in the coal mines?
Yes.
Yes. The operators owned the mines, and they very much controlled the life of everyone else in the coal. There's also an ethnic. This is actually a good question. There's an ethnic hierarchy where if you were a native, by Native American, I don't mean like an American Indian, but if you were native born, you were much more likely to get a good job in the mines, like weighing coal. And if you were a recent immigrant, you were much more likely to be given. You'd be underground. Very few of the above ground jobs went to recent immigrants, and also your place on the seam, because you're being paid by how much coal you can load. There was also sort of a hierarchical business about that, based on ethnic group and kinship networks. Yes.
Do you have some idea of the percentage of native-born Americans and immigrants that worked in the mines?
I think that changed over time. But I think very much predominantly, the folks who were doing the backbreaking work of loading the coal were recent immigrants. One of the things I think it's kind of imperative to understand, to get a sense of what Windber was about. The only reason the town exists, there was no town. There was a bunch of large farms. And the Berwyn White Coal Company sent somebody in who was a geologist who found coal. Like, they started buying up, you see this sort of thing in with mineral rights for fracking, but this was they were buying up mineral rights. They were also buying large chunks of land outright. Send folks, and then the only reason there's a town is they knew there was immense money in coal. I think it's a little bit difficult for us. Maybe some of you all have a little bit of a different sense than I do, but I remember when I was researching this, I was looking at a 1930s eighth grade history book of the Pennsylvania history. And Pennsylvania in the 30s, and Wheeling sort of fits into this as well, it was like California. Money, immense, almost inconceivable amounts of money compared to the rest of the United States. Steel was here, coal was here. These were profoundly lucrative industries, huge amounts of money. So they basically built the town in the service of the mine. The government was owned lock, stock, and barrel by the coal company. Who got to be in charge was decided by the coal company. I hope that answers that to some degree.
So my thought is that it sounded like immigrants were a big part of the coal, and it seems like immigrants continue to be a big part of the jobs that require a lot of labor, building railroads now, and even now they're saying there's so many people that lack of people getting jobs that you rely on immigrants now to hopefully build jobs and farm jobs. It's not like the same thing in the coal industry too. People rely on immigrants to work coal mines.
Certainly hard labor was dominated by the immigrant class in a lot of industries.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of similar kinds of. That was one of the other things that sort of interested me with this book. Is I think there's a lot of similar kinds of prejudice against immigrants, and I think and sometimes the folks who are making a lot of snap judgments about people who come from other countries, if they can see their own grandparents were treated exactly the same way. One of the things that also deeply and profoundly shocked me, in the New York Times, there was an op-ed piece from E.J. Berwin, and there's others by folks like Andrew Carnegie. And what they're basically saying is, if you were from Southern or Eastern Europe, I mean, you weren't white. Firstly, those folks were not considered white at that time. They weren't entirely considered human. They're saying, look, you have to understand. This is the tone of the editorial. You have to understand, these people from Italy, from Greece, from Hungary, from Poland, the Slavs, they're not like you and me. They're not really capable of forming a government or running a town. We really have to take on the hard work of putting together towns just so they have a place to live. We've got to really shoulder this burden for them because they're not capable of this. That's why we need these company-owned towns, because otherwise it would just be chaos. They're not people like us. And I'm like, whoa. And then you see some of the sort of same rhetoric. It's like, oh, these folks who came from blank, blank, blank. It's like, our own grandparents were giving exactly the same kind of treatment. It's like, oh, that's really unfair and horrible. And I think people to see whose interest is this kind of thinking serving. I mean, at the time, it was serving clearly the coal companies. Yes.
I'll just mention this, and it does involve a question. My grandpa, of course, almost everyone here came over from Poland, and he and his brothers worked outside of St. Clairsville in a little coal town called Crabapple. And they did the mining things. My dad and his brothers were hungry on Christmas. They got an orange, and they were thrilled to have it, et cetera, et cetera. But one other thing that my grandfather and my dad, when he was little, and his brothers would have been good.
Oh, yes.
And is any of that in the book?
Have you been reading ahead?
No, that's just my.
Yeah, no, I'm teasing. Yes, actually, that's how the novel. I don't want to ruin anything for anybody. Yes, the prohibition going on under this. You notice that even though they live in a coal patch town, in chapter 2 we get this. They have a radio, which is not a realistic purchase for a coal mining family certainly not during a strike, and not really ever at that period of time. And we learn later that Buzzy has been engaged in driving a wagon and filled with moonshine made on the farms up in Ashtola. In kind of, I don't want to say an industrial level, but everybody there's a lot of moonshine making it in like kind of the basement still sort of thing. But in the novel, the Shiners live out in Ashtola, where there's large farms and very little police presence, and so Buzzy has been working with the Black Hand to deliver moonshine to the surrounding communities through the ethnic clubs. So if he's the Sons of Italy, the Polish Falcons, the Moose, he's going to these various places, and that's how they have more money than you would suspect they have. But that also, let's say, as with much criminal activity, it doesn't end well. I love what you were saying about the orange. I remember my grandparents telling that story as well. So this is a photograph of the striking miners they on one of the large union meetings. And this is what I was saying. So I mentioned that folks were evicted, or you had the capacity to be evicted. So during the 1922 strike in Mine 40, this Patchtown, many of the miners were evicted, and they ended up living in a tent camp in the woods behind the town. So this is how you can another photo. It's a little blurry, but you can see these children. Some of the children have no shoes. This is winter. There was a group coming called the Hirschfield Committee that came down from New York to investigate the situation because E.J. Berlin was selling a lot of the coal from Windber to the New York subway system at very high prices. So they were interested more in kind of like, hey, why is this coal so expensive? And then they found out he was really treating his own workers very badly. So they sent a commission to investigate. They were utterly appalled at the situation in Windber. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.